Thanks, Shailene. What I've got to say fits nicely after Hillel and Susan's introduction. Susan's story about the role of using knowledge and managing risk is the story of the history of Australian farming. This was a hard continent to engage in European farming in, and from the very early days of agriculture, investment in knowledge, technology, new ways of doing things was essential. Once farming started to take root in different regions, invariably it was overset by problems of plant and animal disease, the need to develop new varieties, Australian farming succeeded because we became good at doing that. And that story is going to remain true in a future that's affected by climate change, with greater challenges from variability of climate, even if the world succeeds in the most ambitious, feasible programs of mitigation, because the climate change already in the atmosphere, in the system, will force some change. So the story of the future is just a large-scale story of the past, and Susan's story is an important illustration of what's going to be important. Yesterday in Brisbane, I launched the fourth of my 8 update papers on different topics, updating different issues from the 2008 review. Yesterday's was on transforming land use. It was updating the story of discussion of how domestic and international events are affecting the impact of climate change on the rural sector, and affecting the opportunities for mitigation. So I'm just going to touch here upon a few of the points from that, but the full paper's on the website of the review, Garnaut Review, oneword.org.au. One can think of the farming in the future in Australia as being deeply affected both by climate change and by its mitigation. There will be some, however it's done, however mitigation is done, and we have to think of Australia playing its proportionate part in a global effort if we're going to avoid the worst extremes of climate change. And Australia playing its part will have some direct costs for all parts of the economy, and the rural economy and rural populations will share some of that. But very important when we're thinking of those direct costs to remember that the money that's collected with a carbon price doesn't just disappear. The other side of that coin will be tax cuts, expenditure on research, development and commercialisation of new technologies and other things. And so when thinking of the carbon tax, one also has to think of the carbon tax cut. The rural sector is going to be affected in many ways by the mitigation effort. One that I actually don't address in the paper yesterday, but I'll be coming to in a paper on the electricity sector in March, is that rural Australia will be the locus of most of the expansion of generation capacity under low emissions technology. And that's going to be a significant element of rural development in parts of Australia. But probably the biggest impact on the rural sector from opportunities for mitigation is going to be the one that Hillel focused on, and which Shailene has been working on, the opportunities to earn credits from biosequestration. In the original review in 2008, I discussed these and pointed to very considerable opportunities for sequestering carbon in Australian soils, pastures and woodlands. What we did in yesterday's paper is update a lot of that work. There's been a lot of research undertaken in the last couple of years on that, and it confirms the more speculative story that I told back in 2008, that the technical potential for biosequestration in Australia is very large, potentially transformative both for the Australian mitigation effort and for the economic opportunity of the Australian rural economy. But as Halal mentioned, there are a number of conditions that have to be met to convert an opportunity into value for the Australian rural sector and for the Australian farmer and landowner. One of these is an effective administrative system to define the offsets, to make sure that they're truly based on carbon sequestration. And that work has been done largely by Shailene's group in the Department of Climate Change, and it's emerged as the Carbon Farming Initiative. I think this is very important. It's of global significance. It suggests the incorporation of a wider range of biosequestration credits than is the case in any of the overseas schemes of biosequestration, except possibly Alberta. Alberta's the only close competitor. But as Halal mentioned in his presentation, there will be an issue of demand for credit. There's potentially large supplies of offsets. We don't know exactly what the supply response will be. That's going to depend on decisions that thousands of Australian landowners and farmers make in terms of optimising the value of production on their own properties. And in the nature of things, one can't tell precisely in advance what that's going to be, but it's potentially very large, and it's almost certainly going to be much larger than one could contemplate being absorbed into voluntary or international markets available to Australia. And for that reason, in yesterday's paper, I've suggested a linking of the offsets generated by the Carbon Farming Initiative to the carbon pricing scheme, which would ensure that the farmers get full value for their credits, for their sequestration. And I've suggested doing that in two ways. There's two types of credits identified under the Carbon Farming Initiative: those that are compliant with the international rules as they are currently defined, as they're defined under the various agreements that grew out of the Kyoto discussions in 1997. Now, there are some aspects of those rules that are restrictive, and Australia has chosen to make them more restrictive for reasons that I discuss at length in the paper yesterday. And so there's another category of potential biosequestration credits, which one can call non-Kyoto credits. They're called non-Kyoto credits in the Carbon Farming Initiative. I'm suggesting that the Kyoto credits that are consistent with the current international rules should be capable of being sold to enterprises that are liable for carbon pricing, which have to acquit permits for emissions. But one of the ways they could get those would be by buying Kyoto compliant credits from the farm sector. And for the non-Kyoto credits, I've suggested that part of the revenue raised by the carbon pricing scheme should be made available to purchase non-Kyoto credits. The regulator would manage that. While the farming initiative is operating as offset schemes for reasons of fiscal prudence, to be able to guarantee that the premise that upon which the development of the Australian carbon pricing arrangements has been developed, that the arrangements will be carbon neutral, that no more and no less than the revenue raised by carbon pricing will be given back to the Australian community in one way or another. To be able to ensure the budget neutrality, it will be necessary to place some limits on the total amount of credits, and I discuss in the paper some of the implications of that. And then, so that the Australian farm sector of the future, the rural economy of the future, will be operating within a wider range of opportunities to earn income, some of these new and potentially very large. I also discuss in the paper how the international market situation is likely to be highly favourable for Australian farmers in the period ahead. We've been used to long-term falls in farmers' terms of trade, long-term falls in farm commodity prices, and certainly the second half of last century was characterised by chillingly acute falls in average prices over half a century. There's no reason to expect that that will continue. In fact, there's good reason to think that there'll be a reversal in the 21st century, and we've already seen the beginnings of that. I've discussed the reasons for that in yesterday's paper, and I make considerable reference to a major study that's just been completed by the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., an organisation, the board of which I chaired until last June, which analyses long-term trends affecting supply and demand for food, and it reaches the strong conclusion that global prices are going to be rising fairly strongly of the first half of the 21st century, reversing that powerful trend downwards of the second half of last century. The one basic reason for this is growth in demand. We're all familiar with the contribution of population growth to that. Global population growth is decelerating fairly rapidly, and will probably decelerate more rapidly if the recent acceleration of growth in incomes in developing countries continues. Probably more powerful quantitatively is the effect of growing incomes in much of the developing world on demand for food, partly quantity of staples, increasingly contributions from rising quality of food, higher value food, which converts into larger indirect demand for grains and oilseeds.